Tens of thousands of Israeli demonstrators rallied in Jerusalem against a controversial judicial reform bill that now faces a key vote at the Knesset. This will be a showdown between the hardline religious nationalist coalition and the Israeli society. The vote would mark the first major piece of legislation to be approved. To talk more on this, we have with us Alon Bushten, who is a professor at Israeli Institute, Fellow Department of Political Science, University of California. Thank you so much for joining us on WION, Professor.
Thank you for having me on this historic day.
Absolutely, Alon. It is indeed a historic day, and it has been 6 months, and the demonstrations are unending. Israelis are still out on the streets demonstrating against the judicial reform bill. My question to you is that, has hope for a compromise run out?
So a compromise, a last-ditch attempt at a compromise was proposed yesterday by the president, trying to basically placate all sides, trying to give the opposition something that will show that they have managed to soften this law, and in turn, that the coalition will freeze the ongoing legislation. The opposition is demanding that the legislation be frozen for 15 months. The coalition is rejecting this. The coalition rejected the proposed compromise already. So it's unclear. There probably will be attempts all day, but it's hard to see how a compromise can be reached that both sides will be able to sort of climb down and say, okay, we can live with this.
Right, Alon, what can be expected today at the Knesset?
So the Knesset has been at a marathon vote now for about 30 hours. They're voting on each reservation that the opposition has brought forth, and it's expected to reject all those reservations. And if no compromise is reached, then the vote is expected to go through with the coalition's majority of 64 before this evening. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of people are protesting throughout the country, and specifically around the Knesset. Protesters are they've set up a tent city, and they're setting up sort of a quote-unquote siege around the Knesset in order to demonstrate that, as far as they're concerned, this is the first step and maybe even the last line of defense before dictatorship rules can start being enacted. Because really, in Israel, the reasonableness doctrine is extremely important, because Israel does not have a constitution. It does not have anything that protects the judiciary from the legislator or the government coming and saying, we now remove your ability to pass judgment on anything the government does. We now appoint the son of the prime minister or anyone to be the next attorney general or something like that. The only thing that the Supreme Court can do is say that's not reasonable. So the protesters really feel this is sort of the first step, but also the last line of defense before there could be a cascade towards rules that will bring us more and more to a less democratic or liberal democratic country.
Right. Alon, now the Israel Bar Association is already preparing a legal challenge to the bill. What are the chances of the bill being passed today?
I'd say there's a good chance that the bill is going to be passed today in one form or another. It will either be passed as it is, or they will come up with some nominal compromise to say, see, we have tried to compromise and you're still not satisfied. I think the bill will likely be passed today. What is going to be the major next complication is when this new bill is brought before the Supreme Court, because there are going to be different organizations, like you just said, the Bar Association is going to challenge it to the Supreme Court, and that is the makings of a constitutional crisis. If the Supreme Court says, no, you can't pass this law, it's not reasonable, but really what the Knesset has done is said, well, the Supreme Court does not have the authority to say something's not reasonable. At that point, you have two branches of government, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary saying opposite things. One of them saying, we take away your right to rule and say this is not reasonable. And then the judiciary saying, no, that's not a reasonable move, you can't do that. That is going to lead to a major crisis in Israel that I'm not sure how is going to be resolved in the coming days or coming weeks.
Absolutely, like this uncertainty that hangs in Israel as of now. But taking a few steps back, can you tell us about the judicial overhaul bill and why are people so against it? What are some of its features?
So the overhaul bill was announced less than a week after the government was formed. It was announced on January 4th. And really it was a massive bill, or a series of bills, that was meant to take away the ability of the Supreme Court in Israel to restrain the government. What they were going to do was cancel what they're doing now, the reasonableness doctrine. They were going to change the committee that appoints and nominates judges so that the government would be able to appoint all the judges to the Supreme Court without any review. There would be no one else who could stop them. And they were going to pass what was called an override clause, which would say that the Knesset, the government, can override anything the Supreme Court says. So if, for example, the Knesset would say, we now want to annex the entire West Bank, the Supreme Court would say, no, you can't do that because that violates all kinds of Israeli laws. The government could then come back and say, no, we override what the Supreme Court says, which really would mean that there would be no restraint on the government because Israel does not have a constitution. The government would be able to legislate anything it wants, and there would be no way to stop it or restrain it. And that is why people are saying, even though this seems like small changes, if you take away the ability of the Supreme Court to restrain or stop anything that the government does, really this could be a dictatorship. It may not be right now, but you don't know if next month the government all of a sudden legislates and now people don't have the right to protest, or now people don't have the right to go out and demonstrate or to go out and strike. Then all of a sudden there's not going to be a Supreme Court that could say you can't do that. There's going to be absolutely no legal way to stop the government from moving towards dictatorship. And that is the reason that even though this law itself does not actually bring the country towards a dictatorship, it opens the barrier to which the government or the Knesset will be able to do anything, and you will not be able to legally stop them. And that is what people are so scared of.
Right, that brings me to my next question, Mr. Burstein. Do you think that Israel's identity hangs in the balance over this judicial overhaul bill, which has been going on for the past 6 months in the country?
I think very much so. Israel has defined itself as a Jewish and democratic country, and those have always been in tension because it is very complicated to say on the one hand the country is Jewish and it has a lot of laws that favor Jewish people, like granting citizenship, like the national anthem talks about the Jewish identity and nation, and etc. On the other hand, it also wants to be a democracy. It also wants to respect civil liberties. It also wants to respect minority rights. 21% of the citizenry are Arab citizens who are not Jews. And that has always been in tension, and the country has always lived with that tension. It's always managed to somehow walk this balance and say, we'll give a little bit more to the Jewish side, or we'll give a little bit more to the democratic side. This is coming and saying, we're giving a massive blow to the democratic side, and the country will be more Jewish. And it is really a challenge to the identity of people as they call themselves Israeli. What does that mean for the future? That is part of the reason it's bringing out so much emotion in the country.
Right. Now, U.S. President Joe Biden has also tried to pressurize Netanyahu against the judicial overhaul bill. Do you think that the passing of the bill, if it does that, will that put relations between the U.S. and Israel in jeopardy?
I think that there are two levels to the relationship between the United States and Israel. The first level is security, the security relationship between the two countries, between the militaries, between the intelligence. I honestly think that that is probably going to not be affected. Both countries have a vast interest, regardless of what the nature of Israel's democracy is, have a vast interest of maintaining that relationship. But there is another level. There is the special relationship between the United States and Israel. There's the fact that the United States protects Israel in all international bodies. There's the fact that the two countries often don't vote against each other in the United Nations or things like that. That is likely to start getting affected after this bill is passed. Like we see, the United States has no problem being friends with countries that are not democracies. They have no problem exchanging arms with countries that are less democratic. But the special relationship that it has with Israel, the fact that it protects Israel in international court, the fact that it protects Israel in all kinds of human rights criticisms, the fact that it does all kinds of things like that, that is likely to start getting affected. And we'll see as time goes on to what extent. But that part of the relationship is not going to survive and go intact as a result of these moves, I'm pretty sure.
Last question to you, Mr. Allen. Now, Netanyahu earlier halted the bill, but now he's moving ahead, going forward with it. I want to ask you and seek your perspective as to why is Netanyahu not backing down from the judicial overhaul, despite now pressure from Biden and also scores of demonstrations that have been taking place for the past few months in the country?
So Netanyahu is really being pressured from all sides. His coalition is made up of extremely hawkish and right-wing elements and also religious elements that all want this bill to pass and want further judicial overhaul bills to pass. They all want to do things that the Supreme Court would say is undemocratic, such as favoring people who study in religious schools as opposed to people studying secular schools, or favoring Jews officially. in different laws as opposed to non-Jews. And the Supreme Court would stop this, and so his coalition members are really pressuring him and constantly threatening that the government may not be stable if he does not move forward. So that's one reason that he is really pressured to move forward. Another reason is he himself is under charges of bribery, breach of trust, and corruption, and these laws will largely benefit him. Once the coalition under his regime gets the ability to nominate the Supreme Court judges, he will be able to nominate the judges that will then judge his appeal should he be found guilty. Once the reasonableness bill is passed, he will be able to fire the Attorney General, who is his prosecutor in court, fire her and appoint someone else. So there's really two big motivators that are motivating him to continue, even though he sees the damage that's being done to the country. And he's constantly putting out messages trying to say everything's going to be okay, trust me. Unfortunately, he has not lived up to most of his deals that he has made throughout the years, so there's very little trust in the opposition or in the protest movements that Netanyahu will eventually see the light and do what's good for the country. But really, that's the reason that even though he's a very good politician, he sees the reality, he sees what's happening, he has other considerations that are likely driving him to move forward.
Well, absolutely, Mr. Allen. We'll have to wait and see how things take place at the Knesset today. But thank you so much for joining us on WION and sharing your insights with us on this.
And thank you for following this, and I will probably speak to you again soon about it. Take care.
Thank you.